Hi friends, hope you're doing well. We're going to be part 2 of the final beast empire. And really that's what we're talking about. So the final beast empire and the Antichrist himself and how this all plays out and what we're seeing happen right now, I think, is leading to the Antichrist and his soon appearing on the stage. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But if you haven't watched part 1, please do. Like, subscribe, and then share it with other people. And then again, I hope you like this one as well. Like, subscribe, share it with other people. I really appreciate that. It does help me get this word out, which I really want to do more than anything else. It's not about getting likes or subscriptions. That really isn't something I desire, but it does help me in a sense to reach out in my videos, be shown more, and people get these, and hopefully it helps them in their walk, their journey with the Lord, and their growth in the Lord. Okay, so we already talked about in Daniel 2, Daniel 8, and Daniel 9. We've kind of gone into that. So we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 11. It's one that's often overlooked or misunderstood. I won't go through the whole detail of it, really, but at some point I'll do a study on Daniel, the book of Daniel, like I do book by book, because I think that's the best way to do it, chapter by chapter. And someday I'm going to go through that, probably not too far in the distant future, but right now we're working through the New Testament. But Daniel will definitely be on there, and sometime we'll take a break and we'll just go to Daniel and do it, because I think it's important because of the times in which we live. But just not to break it up too much, basically, as you get into it, I'll kind of give you a brief one as we get in the second half of Daniel 11, because we're going to really focus in on verse 36 all the way to 45. We won't read it all, but we'll certainly touch on it. So basically, as you get into it, from my understanding of it, as I read it and study it, basically verse 31 is dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes. That is really who it's talking about and how he was causing issues and problems and so forth for Israel. And it was around roughly in the end of his life, in that time frame. So it was between 160, 164 BC, somewhere in that time frame. Anyway, he goes down and talks about how because of that, you're going to have this Maccabean Revolt is going to take place. And that's in verse 32, I think, is talking about the Maccabean Revolt. Verse 33, I think, is the end. As you get into the end times, it's talking specifically about Christians. And then 34, the Holy Spirit, obviously. And 34, the end of that would be false converts. And then 35 gets into Christian martyrs throughout the church age, is kind of how I look at how those are broken down. 36 is where we're going to pick up. So 36 is the Antichrist all the way through to really 45. And that's really where we're going to focus in on our study. The final beast empire, and the beast himself obviously is part of that because it's a central component of the beast empire. So he says, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished for that which is decreed to be done. Okay, well, we know that that's specifically the same language spoken of in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. Now, some people apply that to Antiochus Epiphanes. Certainly well could be. But I think as you read through it, it seems to be alluding to this one that is going to wind up being the Antichrist, who is interesting. And we'll get into it in a little bit, but Revelation 13, 5 and 6 is also kind of referenced there in a sense. But he goes in and says, it's finished for that which is decreed is done. And he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. Some people say, well, that's because he's homosexual. Not necessarily. Could be. Could just be that he's so encompassed with power and control that he has no desire, normal, natural desires for women, in a sense. He's not manipulated by the sexual desires of women. He's instead so focused on power and domination of the world and his, in essence, his own perceived deity status as God-man on earth, that he don't have a natural affinity for women where he's manipulated by women. And it could be something as simple as that. He doesn't have to be that he's homosexual, but it very well could mean that he may have those proclivities. Maybe he's bisexual. Who knows? It says, nor will he show regard for any other gods, that he will magnify himself above them all. Well, that's a direct reference to 2 Thessalonians 2:4. He's going to magnify himself that he's God, the God-man, we know there's only one God-man, Jesus Christ, who came fully God, the second person of the Triune Godhead, who came and took upon flesh, becoming fully God and fully man, the hypostatic union as we know it. Theologically, that's how we understand it. And he's going to come and say that he's the God-man, and he's going to do these wonders, which obviously are deceptions by Satan, to deceive the masses of the world. And that's a number of things where it talks about that in 2 Thessalonians, also in Revelations, and it talks about how the book of Revelation, how this is, a manipulation to deceive the planet, and the world falls for it. So we see that happening. We see the Antichrist is going to be the one who's basically doing this, and he's going to magnify himself. He's going to, but what's interesting, he says that he shows no regard for the gods of his fathers. Some people take that to mean, and I certainly kind of agree with that, is that that could be a reference to the fact that he's Jewish. And it makes sense. If he's going to go into the temple and declare himself to be God, he most likely has to be Jewish. The Jews are not likely going to let, if they rebuild a temple, are not just going to let a Gentile walk into their temple. Not going to happen. Contrary to whatever they're saying now. The reality is, when they build a temple, the Jews are not, non-Jews not just going to be able to walk into the temple, much less walk into a central component of it. He may be able to walk into the part where it's the part where the nations are, Gentile nations, so forth, are allowed, but not in the temple itself. And I think that's going to be why I think it's referencing that he won't show any regard for the gods of his father. I think he's talking about that reality, that in the sense that he will most likely be of Jewish persuasion. And a lot of people know how I feel and who I think it is, and I'll allude to that at the end of this when we get to near the end of the video, and why I feel that and where we're headed. I kind of talked about it in the previous one, but I'll pick up a little bit more as we get into it. So he goes on to say that at the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with his chariots and horsemen and so forth. So we know that some people take this out to be that it was a combination of Ptolemy and various elements of the dynasties of the Grecian Empire that came out of that, and some people look at it in that sense. But the reality is, I look at it and go, no, you look at what it's doing and what it's talking about. It's clearly stating he's not from the south, he's not from the north, and it goes on to say that those of the east will escape his control or his hand. Edom, Moab, which we would know, Ammon, which we know as Jordan, and so forth. Well, we know that he's going to not come from the east, he's not going to come from the north, he's not going to come from the south. So it only leaves the west. And that's why I think as it gets into this, it's identifying that this, again, going back, who is this beast empire and where is he coming from? Again, it all points to the west and its western powers. And ultimately, I think it's alluding to this revived Roman Empire that will be global in nature, much more expansive, that will hold the ideals, premises, the visual aspects of the Roman Empire. It doesn't necessarily have to be centered in Rome even. It just has the elements of the Roman Empire. Just like you see the expansion from Rome to Constantinople, and you see 10 toes coming out, expanding again to 10 nations. It's going to be much more expansive. And that, remember, the Roman Empire, head of it, was moved to Constantinople, and it can certainly move again. And I think that's why I believe the United States may very well be the preeminent nation, and I think that because part of the preeminent nation, a part of the Beast Empire, and I think that because if it's going to happen soon, it's the most preeminent military power in the world. It's also economic control over the world in a lot of ways. And if it seems to be waning, as some people like to think, it is forming a coalition, an alliance with other nations, and these other nations, 10 total, will wind up becoming this new empire that will be unlike any other in the sense it's so powerful that really who can resist it economically, technologically, and monetarily and any other way, militarily. So you look at the things that it's going to be able to do, no one's really going to be able to stand up to it or make war with it. It's how they're going to look at it, just like the Bible talks about who can make war with the beast. And I think that's the case here. It's going to be very powerful, but yet we know it's not going to be the kings of the east because it's the kings of the east that come against him. So we know that China and most likely India is ruled out. So, and North Korea and maybe some other ones there. but it will be a global empire that will come out of the West primarily. And I believe we're seeing that element with United States, UK, Australia. I think they're the first ones of a new empire that will emerge after this vacuum that will be created by the destruction of the armies that will come against Israel and out of the Gog-Magog alliance that comes down, which may be very near. So this is how it's talking about that. Then he goes on to say that he will pitch his tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, and yet will come to his end, and no one will help him. That's interesting, very interesting. And the verse before it talks about rumors of the east and from the north will disturb him. Well, right then and there, it tells you that it won't be the kings of the east and it won't be the kings of the north. So he's definitely someone who I think is coming clearly from the west. And we see that Western Empire. So that, to me, it tells me that most likely elements of Europe, elements of America, well, certainly probably Canada, America, others will be a part of this final beast empire. And, which kind of, it talks about these kings of the east, that directly references and falls in line with what we see in Revelation 16:12. Kings of the east come against him. And that goes into Revelation 9, where the 200 man army we know about coming out of the east. But this here talks about him being on the holy mountain, very similar to what we see in Revelation 19, verse 20. Same thing in other places, Daniel 8:25, so forth. But when it talks about him pitching his tent, I found that very fascinating, because when we looked at the establishment, and this may be totally off, who knows? I'm just throwing this out there. When the embassy of the United States was announced and placed in Jerusalem and declared as the most predominant Gentile power in the world, as Rome was at the time when they said Rome, that Jerusalem is no more. We're going to rename it Philistinia, right? Instead, he says, we're going to, as the most Gentile power in the world, in essence, the revived Roman Empire, in a sense, that's happening, occurring as we see it. Says, no, we're going to acknowledge that the city of Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish people in Israel. And then they established and set their embassy right there. And it's strange, if you do a Google search, right where it's situated just between the holy mountain, where the Temple Mount's at, and the sea. Exactly what it kind of talks about here. Very well could be that this is part of the head of this new empire that's going to rise up, and that will still be its embassy. And it's mounted right there between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. And if you do Google search, you're going to see that what I'm talking about. It's exactly what we see right now. It's exactly situated between the two, right almost dead center. When I looked up, unless I missed it or made a mistake, which I looked at it pretty carefully. I think I got it right. So you can look that up if I'm wrong. Just correct me in the text. But when I looked it up, I was like, wow, that's very fascinating. And I don't know why I looked that up, but I was just like, well, I wonder where it's at in Israel. And I looked it up, and it was like weird. I was like, and the thing that struck me was that verse. When I saw it, I was like, wow, that's exactly centered right between the Temple Mount and the sea. Why would you put it right there? And I just was curious where it was situated in Israel. But you can look that up yourself and see. And if it is, if I got it right, just make a comment and say you're right, or I'm wrong, you can correct me. But yeah, when I looked it up, I was like, wow, if what I looked up was right, it's dead center between. And I think it was just a tiny bit north of it, but it was dead center between the two. I was like, wow, interesting. Anyway, let's kind of jump to Revelation chapter 17, verses, we're going to look at we'll do verse 7 through 13. And it just goes on to talk about this, this final global, so it's talking about this whore Babylon early on in chapter 17, this global ecumenical religious system that in essence is situated, it appears, in what we call Rome for sure, and its abominations and its deceptions, violence committed against Christians historically, drunk with the blood of the saints, those who have died for the faith. But this final in essence, global ecumenical religious system is going to ride upon this beast empire that's arising, and then this final beast empire, which will also have an economic facet to it, which we see in Revelation chapter 18, global reach, also in Revelation 13. We won't read 18 because we just won't have time for it, but 18 is basically talking about this global economic system and where it's situated and what city. I think that gets a little murky to be able to actually identify that city. Could be, some people claim New York City, other people say it's Rome, other people, at the end of the day, really murky, hard to say. Some people say it's London because that is the center of all banking. I think that more perfectly fits instead of New York City. I think really London fits it more than anything else, but it's on the sea and so forth, but hard to say for sure. But most of the banking in the world and everything is done in London, actually, not New York. So very fascinating. But the traders and all that stuff is typically through America. But anyway, could be either one. So it gets a little murky there, I think, and to try to identify that one city, a little tough. So, but if you read through 18, you'll see that in essence it's talking about this final economic system that is very oppressive. And that's what we see with what's going on today. It is very repressive of people and robber of people's life and liberty and ability to their labor. They work their whole life to pay off one thing because they paid so much in between taxes and interest. They work their whole life to the point where, and at the end of the day, they have nothing to show for it, and they're impoverished. You see that system that's played out on a massive, broad, global scale. And that's what's happening, and I think it's just going to be worse than the Beast Empire season time period. But anyway, that's what's happening right now with the global economic system that's been in place for a long time, and that's unfortunate. So many people do suffer from that. He goes on to say here that in key things I want to talk about is, it goes on to talk about that this woman is carried along, this beast carries her. So this global religious new world order is going to ride upon the power of this beast empire that's going to emerge. The strength of this beast empire is going to carry in this new global religious world order. And in that world order, it's going to have the lying deception of the rejection of Christ and the truth of God and His Word, and the acceptance of ecumenicalism and secularization infused into it, so that all other religions in essence embrace this except for the truth, the exclusivity of Jesus Christ and the exclusivity of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's rejected, and that's why they become martyrs for the rejection of the Antichrist as its God and King, and the rejection of this ecumenical and secularized view and teaching that will infuse and is infusing in the cultures of the world right now and the religions of the world as they embrace this lie and deception of, in essence, your own godhood, your own reality, your own truth, and that there is no reason to repent. Everything's relevant. There is no absolute truth. There's no foundation of truth. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they're going to want to fall victim to the lie of deception of Satan and the worship of his false God-man, the Antichrist. And that's really what's going to happen. We see that in Revelation 13, which we're going to be going there really quickly. And he says, he goes down, he says, the beast, and that's where we want to focus on, verse 8, the beast that which you saw, which is about to come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life and the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come again. So this beast is going to rise up. Again, it could be alluding back to Revelation chapter 11 where it talks, or 9, where it talks about this one coming up out of the abyss, 11 and 9. We know him as Abaddon and so forth, who's going to possess, I believe, the Antichrist human being. And in essence, remember, the Antichrist is also possessed by Satan himself. But this one who's over the abyss as well could very well be a demonic being, not a fallen angel, but a demonic being, where we know Antichrist is a fallen cherub and fallen angel. He will be possessed by these and empowered by them. So he'll have authority over this horde that comes out of the abyss of unclean spirits or demonic spirits, while Satan himself is ultimately empowering himself with this power and authority over the earth that he has right now for a limited period of time. Anyway, it goes down, he gives this power and authority to the Antichrist. And anyway, he goes on to talk about this beast, which we know is the Antichrist, and this beast empire. And he goes on verse 9, and here's a mind which is wisdom, that the 7 heads and 7 mountains of which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and another is not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. A lot of people look at that and say, well, that's Egypt, Assyria, Medo-Persia, Greece, Babylon. You got a list of all these nations, and then ultimately you come to Rome and then the revived Roman Empire. Well, you can look at it like that, I guess. That's one way to look at it. Another would be to look at it and go that it's talking about these 7 heads and these 7 mountains, and the 7 mountains and nations could be, some people say, well, that's the 7 mountains of which Rome sits, the Vatican, known as the city that sits on 7 hills, and that's going to be headed up. Some people look at that, I kind of see it as, the 7 hills or 7 mountains as potentially 7 nations. And because remember, 3 is overthrown, Antichrist comes to it, and these 7 heads are the 7 heads or 7 kings over these 7 nations. It's part of this final empire. Ultimately, beginning there was 10, but ultimately there's only going to be 7. We know because 3 are overthrown. That's, I think, what it's talking about personally. And then it says that verse, go down a little bit further, and it just goes on to say that the beast which you saw in verse 11 was and is, he himself is an 8th. Again, we know that the Antichrist is going to come up, rise up after these 7 leaders, and overthrow 3 of the 10, and that will wind up leaving 7. And he goes on to say that 8th and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have not received their kingdom, but when they receive their authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour, so it's going to be a very short period of time. Remember, their reign is very short. Some people say, well, it's exactly 7 years. I think it's a little over 7 years. I think it will have to rise up, come into power, and then it will ultimately reign for the 7 years of tribulation when they declare the final peace agreement for 7 years. That's the beginning of the final week of 7 years. But he has to be in power, and that beast empire has to be in power for him to rise up and declare that. So, he has to come up and then overthrow 3. So I think it's going to be a period of time before that 7-year tribulation period of time. So this beast empire may reign for a number of years before that. It could be 3 years, could be 1 year, could be 5 years. I'm not sure, but it has to be a period of time. I think it's going to be a very short time because it's saying they're only going to reign for 1 hour. So a relatively short period of time when you really look at it. It's going to be, we know for sure, no more than 7 years, or no less than 7 years. Could slightly be more than I fall in the category of slightly more than 7 years because I think it has to have this ability to raise up, have a power, have authority, have everything that's in place to control the mechanisms, the government, the agreements, and everything has to be, it's going to take a little while, but I think it will happen faster than most people think, and then ultimately you'll bring in the other things, and that's why I think it's going to take a little while for that beast empire to establish its mark of the beast and so forth, because it's in that process of developing all the structures needed to do that, the laws, everything, the agreements and everything else that has to happen. But anyway, it's going to reign for a very short period of time. We know that for sure. So for 1 hour. And the Antichrist is ultimately going to be the one who leads it up. And it even goes to say that the 10 horns, which you saw, are 10 kings, which have not received the king. So, and over 3 of them are going to be overthrown. We know that. We've already talked about that previously. So 3 are going to be overthrown. And then you have, it says the kings that are with him. Remember, it said there's 7 kings as well. There's 7 heads. And then it goes on to say that this reign for 1 hour. So these have one purpose, and that they give their power and authority to the beast. So these 7 leaders are ultimately going to give their power to the 8th. And the 8th is the Antichrist, the beast. He's going to rise up. And remember, this one who's going to come up will overthrow 3 of those 7 of those 10. So remember that when you see 7 heads and 10 horns, and ultimately the beast comes up and he overthrows 3 of them, and it leaves you with 7. So the 10 and the 7 are all kings. It starts to make sense. So the 10 are kings, 3 are overthrown by the Antichrist, who's the 8th, who comes up. He's one of the 7. Okay, I get it. He's one of the 7, which means he's the leader of one of the primary 7 nations, and he's going to overthrow 3 of them, and ultimately you're going to have 7 and he's the eighth that will eventually rise up and be that power over all of the seven. But he's initially just part of the seven. So let's say, for instance, it's the United States. He's the leader of the United States. You have the UK, Australia, Canada, so forth, laid out there. He's one of them. They agree to come together as a coalition. Ultimately, he winds up overthrowing three of them and removing their leadership and taking direct control over these three who maybe weren't playing ball. And then they come together and agree to a coalition. And then this coalition says, you're going to be our representative prime minister. So we elect you to not only the president of your country, but you're going to be the president of this entire new coalition. And they nominate him, and he winds up being the supreme authority over the entire alliance. That's what it's talking about, if that makes sense. So he's a leader of his own nation, but then he becomes the leader of this entire federation. That's what's happening. That's what it's talking about. That's what we should be looking for. A leader of his own nation that winds up becoming part of a bigger coalition, and eventually he overthrows three, replaces their leaders with his own authority, and then winds up taking control or taking the head of, as in essence, a super emperor or total supreme authority over all of the alliance. And that's really what it's talking about. So the Antichrist will come from the west of this final beast empire. He will magnify himself, declare himself to be God, and he will ultimately be the leader of one of the seven nations that will survive of the 10, and then he will overthrow three of them, take possession of three of those out of the 10 nations directly. It will become a part of his overseeing authority, which will answer directly to him, and then, but he will ultimately be elected completely, totally overseeing the power and authority over this entire alliance that's going to rise up, and it will fill a vacuum that's going to happen. And I think this vacuum is very near with the soon coming Gog-Magog war. So that takes us to Revelation 13. So let's jump over to Revelation 13 real quickly, and then we'll close it out right there. So Revelation 13 is this amazing chapter in which it kind of talks about this, what we're talking about, the 10 horns and 7 heads. You know what we're talking about. So this final one is going to wind up being over this entity, or these 10 leaders, and ultimately it's going to have these 10 nations, or 7 nations that will, because remember, 3 are overthrown. So 7 nations, 10 leaders, and ultimately at the end of the day, you're going to end up with 3 of them overthrown over this final authority when it's all said and done. So 13, basically verses 1, kind of talks about that, so we won't read through that, but then it goes into verse 2 where it talks about how he's going to have the vestiges or abilities or what do you want to call it, aspects of these previous kingdoms. You know, it talks about these ones, you know, like a leopard and feet like a bear, and you know, it's talking about these elements that were originally part of those original kingdoms, which, going back to Daniel, will make sense. And then it kind of goes into, it says that they worship the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. So the beast is getting his direct authority from this beast, this dragon, which is Satan himself. Dragon is Satan, and we know that from Revelation chapter 12. It tells us the dragon is Satan. He's the one who was cast down. You know, it's like pretty straightforward. So we know that the dragon is Satan, and Satan has given his power to the Antichrist, just like he offered to Christ, because he didn't know who the Messiah was, and so he asked him. He says, "If you're the Messiah, if you are the Messiah, then bow down and worship me." Now, obviously, he knows if he's a mere man, he'd see all the kingdoms of the world have been given to me, and I can give it to whoever I wish. If this was a mere man, he would probably fall for it. But if it's God in the flesh, he knows there's no way he's going to fall for it because he's God. Instead, is exactly what Jesus said. He says, "We worship the Lord your God only." And that's what he was basically saying to him. If we were there, he probably would have said, "No, you should be worshiping me." You know, you worship the Lord your God only. And he should have been pointing at himself, you know, or probably was pointing at himself, and knowing that Satan should have been worshiping him instead of, asking him to worship him. But he was testing to see, because Satan obviously isn't omniscient. He doesn't know all things. He was trying to find out who is the real Messiah. So I'm prepared and I know how to act. He knew he was coming. He knew the prophecies of the one who's going to come. He didn't know who it was exactly, but he was testing to see if it really was God. And obviously he found out that Jesus is the real deal. Anyway, so he's going into it. So we know that this dragon gives his authority to the beast. The Antichrist is going to reign, and he's going to cause everybody to worship him. Again, going back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we see that he's going to declare himself to be God. We see the same thing here in Revelation 13. And as he's going down through this, we see that he's going to have total power and authority over all people. And the people who become Christians during this period of time were going to be martyred or killed. And that's why it tells us that, this is going to call for perseverance on the part of the saints. Because God's not going to intervene like he does now. A lot of things could happen to us, and God intervenes, and I think stops bad things from happening to us. He's not during this period of time. People come to Christ during this period of time are going to be martyred. He's going to overcome them. And that's why, again, I don't believe the church is here for various reasons for another video. But chapter 7 kind of talks about who those people are. They are the tribulation saints who are martyred. Those are the ones who are part of the first resurrection. The church is already in heaven before that first resurrection. So, again, numerous things you could point to. The point why the church has to be raptured pre-tribulationally, in my opinion. And this one is just one of those things where he overcomes the world, and we know Satan cannot, the gates of hell shall not overcome the church, right? Anyway, it goes down to various aspects of what he's doing and how ultimately he's going to cause all people, verses 16 through 18, to take the mark of the beast, in which he has total economic control of the world. And he will cause people to, they can't buy, sell, or trade. So they're going to have total economic control. And we know from Revelation 17, they have total religious control. And they're going to have total control of the economy. And they're going to have total control with their power in the military, preeminent power in the military. That's what we see happening. And I think that's what's occurring right now, in an infant type state of it. But that's what's happening right now with the coalitions in the West. Keep your eye on those things. Keep your eye on the peace agreements that are being signed in the Abraham Accords and the people that are involved in it. I think ultimately that, in my opinion, I'm not saying Jared Kushner is the Antichrist, but he certainly fits the bill. He's Jewish. He could go into temple if it's rebuilt. He's certainly the one pushing for a peace agreement around the world, and he's having that, which would directly fulfill what, in essence, how the Jews see it from the Old Testament eyes of causing peace to occur around the world. And bringing in also the rebuilding of the temple from Zechariah. From their eyes and their vantage point, they would see him as their Messiah. Whereas we would look at him and say, no, he's the Antichrist, because we see it from the New Testament eyes looking back. Anyway, I hope this is a blessing to you. Keep looking up. I think the end is so near, and times are getting really exciting. That means that the rapture of the church is very near. God bless. We'll see you.